Hello, friends and fellow VEDSies, and welcome back to Vlog Every Other Day in September. I got a question for you real quick. What is the best thing you have spent money on recently? It could be an experience, it could be a really good meal. For me, it's a comic book. Unsurprising. I got a lot of comic books. This is all comic books. I buy a lot of them. It's a problem. But I enjoy them, which I guess is better than buying them and disliking them. But this one was one I wasn't planning on buying. I was at the comic store. Shout out to Rick's Comic City here in Nashville. And I look over and I see that they have these for sale. Usagi Yojimbo omnibuses. An omnibus, if you haven't read comics, is kind of like the big collection of it. So you got, let me show you. You got single issues, which are these things, what you would expect when I say comic book. Stapled together, one little bit of a story. And then you got trades, like these are multiple issues collected together into a book. It can be hardcover, it can be paperback. It's also, if you had graphic novels, what that would be. But sometimes you need to put a bunch of trades together and you get what's called an omnibus, which is like 3 or 4 trades smashed together. Anyway, we're talking about this one, Usagi Yojimbo. Usagi Yojimbo was a comic that I got into a couple years ago. Read it for the first time for a podcast I do called All New 52, where I talk about comics with my friend Joe. I picked Usagi Yojimbo because it is a pretty prevalent and prevailing piece of creator-owned work. Creator-owned just means, in the comic realm, that you have like your big 2 publishers, Marvel and DC, and if you write anything for them, they get to keep that. They get to keep those characters and continue on with their stories long after you're gone. That has created a lot of different issues with different creators over time. And so in the 90s, you guys see more and more people moving to a creator-owned space. A big independent publisher called Image opened up, made largely from people who were leaving the big 2. And that kind of created a little bubble of independent comics. Now, a lot of those little studios that came up in the bubble have closed down, but some of those creator-owned comics carried on to other publishers, like Usagi Yojimbo. Stan Sakai started out on Fantagraphics and created Usagi Yojimbo, the story about a samurai who just happens to be a rabbit, playing into a kind of other bubble that was forming in the 90s about talking animal comics, probably most famously the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Sakai had actually wanted to do a samurai comic for a long time and was planning to originally just do it with people. But then he decided, over the course of however long it took him to get this published, I was like, maybe I'm going to do a rabbit instead. And it's created a really fun world of this historical Japan that is very realistic in time and setting, but also has these fun anthropomorphized characters. Going back a little bit, Stan Sakai makes Usagi Yojimbo. It's very successful, and he does a little bit of Fantagraphics. He hops over to Dark Horse at one point, who published this. He's hopped around to a couple different publishers because he can do that, because he is a creator-owned person. He now has his own imprint working with Dark Horse, actually. So when I started reading him, I just picked up from the library a random trade of Usagi Yojimbo from one of the times Dark Horse had it, which you can do with Usagi Yojimbo because it is very serialized stories. There are ongoing arcs, but for the most part, they're over in a couple issues. Now, I enjoyed that trade when I read it for the podcast, but I didn't have any instant desire to go back to Usagi Yojimbo. But then I was updating my pool list. That's the comics that come out each month that my comic book store sets aside for me to pick up. And when I was redoing it, I was like, let's just throw Usagi Yojimbo on there because I want to be reading more indie stuff, so why not this? And after reading a couple issues of the current Usagi Yojimbo run, I was like, this started looking real good to me. So I picked up and I bought it, and it has been the comic that I've had on my nightstand and I've picked up every other night or so and been reading and enjoying. And it's perfect for that because, like I said, these stories aren't very long, but they are very good, and their serialized nature leads to a lot of variety. For example, first story arc in here, a couple issues with crossover with previously mentioned Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Dark Horse at the time, and I think they still do, had the rights to publish those comics. Crossed over, it makes sense, they're two very similar properties. And that kind of took me by surprise. I knew they crossed over at some point. I was just kind of surprised that was the very first story in this omnibus. But then you hop away from that and you get into another story that's much more archetypical samurai, kind of what you would expect from an old samurai film. You know, he rocks up into this town. The magistrate is kind of trying to bully these farmers out. And I start reading and I'm like, okay, this is cool. This is stuff that I'm used to. This is like a Kurosawa film. And then I get to the end. I'm like, wow, this is really starting to get very dark and, not graphic. It's ultimately a bunny holding a sword. It's not going to get like bloody and full of guts. But it does get kind of heavy and kind of dark. And it leaves off Usagi in a place where he is technically the victor, but there's no satisfaction in his victory. And then jump to like him as a kid being trained. I'm like, oh, this is kind of cool. And then it jumped to a wordless issue about the little dinosaur rodent creatures that live in this world. And then it kind of kept going. There's always a different story. There's always a different type of tale to tell. And it's incredibly well told. There is a simplicity of craft in this, but really Sakai is a master of figuring out how to pack as much narrative into as little space as he needs to clearly convey a story and theme. I wouldn't say like each tale has a moral, but Usagi is a very moral figure. He kind of fits into a role of samurai that's very honorable and stuff. And so you do kind of get these very clear moral choices made that make for very satisfying stories. Whether or not that's some type of taboo that is crossed, whether that is a standard that is not lived up to, or whether that is a moral victory, whether that be one that brings satisfaction or, like I previously stated, one that doesn't. And so to go back to that question I posed at the front of the video, the best money I've spent in a while is honestly this, because it's provided me with a lot of narrative satisfaction, a lot of entertainment, for honestly not that much. And I'm gonna probably keep diving deeper into the world of Usagi Yojimbo, a comic book that did not get its teeth into me immediately, but definitely has now. So that's the video. I'm curious if any of you had heard of Usagi Yojimbo before then. I feel like if you spend your time in comic book stores, you will recognize the design if nothing else. But I don't think that there has really ever been that piece of culture that's, or piece of pop culture that's pushed into, even like a sub-level of the mainstream consciousness. I think is pretty safely to say this is still mostly known as a comic, unlike like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which started as a comic but is now mostly known as like a kid's show. And that's where I will leave us off for this video. If you're curious, this was going to be part of my original theme that was just going to be comic books. I was just going to talk about them, and that's why I sprinkled in a little bit of explanation about like creator-owned stuff and the differences of format and stuff, because those were all going to have their own videos. The themes are kind of useful for guiding you throughout VEDS, but since I whittled it down to only 15 videos this year, I decided not to have one and just kind of compress the ideas into one video. But speaking of kind of guidance or inspiration or what you will call it, my next video does come out on the 7th, which means it'll be a full week for those friends of mine who are doing VEDS as a whole. So I think I'm going to propose a little bit of a challenge in my next video to kind of help them if they run out of video ideas. I don't know if anyone else has done any challenges this year because I'm recording this before VEDS actually starts, but I'm very excited for what I'm going to propose.